There's more chairs up front, so come on up. Okay, everyone have a seat? 2 more people coming in. There's some seats up front, so you can come on up. Several over here. Up front, there's some seats. For those of you coming in, there's some seats up front. There's 2 here and 2 here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Serene Jones, and I'm the president here at Union Theological Seminary, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this evening's conversation. It is our March series of the program series called Faith in America that was launched this year. It is a series that takes many of the pressing social justice issues of the day that often quickly flash on the screen and then disappear. This event is our chance as a theological school to take those issues and to bring together some of the leading thinkers in our nation today to reflect together on them in a deeper theological context and with more conversation and focus than they usually get. It's been a wonderful series this year, and this evening we're very lucky to have not with us sort of star-studded leaders that you read about in the New York Times, but I think in a very important way, a group of extraordinary everyday leaders who are taking on these questions that Faith in America addresses and doing it at a grassroots level in their communities and creating change. And they're able to do this because each one of them, who will present a case study to us tonight, takes very seriously not only the overt ways in which groups ask and issues come to the fore and policies are made, but the often hidden and unconscious dynamics tied to group behavior, and uses that as a context for thinking about how one engages, promotes, and makes social change happen, which includes thinking about groups, not just as groups apart from you, but groups of which you yourself as a change agent are a part. So I'm very happy to introduce them. I want to first mention the next 2 Faiths in America. On April 5th, we're going to be having one focused on the work of Lema Gbowie, who is the Nobel Prize winner after whom the film by Abigail Disney, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, is about, a woman of faith who played a critical role in deposing Charles Taylor in Liberia. And then after that, on the 20th of April, we'll be having a special Faith in America hosting the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who many of you may have seen this summer as one of the speakers at the Democratic National Convention, but is a very active national force for justice and the movement for deep social change in this country right now. So we have a special word of thanks due to Frances Unsell, who pulled all this together, and I'm going to introduce her in more detail. But the way the evening will work is I'm going to introduce to you now our panelists, and then I'll introduce Frances. Frances will say a few words to frame the discussion, and then we will hear from each of our panelists, and we'll have a chance then to open it up to discussion between us. And it's good. We usually do these in the chapel. We decided to do that here so we could have a more intimate context where we have time for some real interaction. So first, I'm excited to introduce Alec McNeill. Alex is the first openly transgendered person to head a mainline Protestant organization. Imagine that. I mean, really quite remarkable. He is the CEO of More Light Presbyterians. He's a lifelong Presbyterian and a nationally known educator and candidate for ordination. His journey to ordination is chronicled, if you're interested, in a documentary called Out of Order. He has played key roles in organizing faith communities for the passage of marriage equality amendment in the Presbyterian Church in the state of Maryland. And currently, his organization is working with faith communities across North Carolina to repeal HB 2, the bathroom bill. So we'll have a chance to hear about the bathroom bill tonight in the theological context. I'm also happy to introduce Amy Gregory. Amy is a graduate of Union, very proud of that. And for the past 13 years, she has done work taking groups from Greene, New York, rural New York, to build houses in Bosnia under the supervision of Muslims who have been terrorized by genocide. But her work is about much more than building houses. It's about how do we build connections and how do we create cooperative partnerships in the context of enormous and ongoing trauma. This involves navigating delicate and complex issues related to gender in a country where women don't do construction. It involves Muslim-Christian relations, working side by side with people who are still experiencing the lasting effects of trauma, and demonstrating what voluntarism in a society looks like for a society who doesn't even have the concept of a volunteer. She's also a student of C.G. Jung in Zurich and pastor of First United Methodist Church in Greene, New York. So we have a Presbyterian and a Methodist. I'm very happy to welcome Victoria Barnett, known fondly to many of us here at Union as Vicky. Vicky is the director of the program on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Quite a remarkable role to have. In this capacity, she works with seminaries and university faculty, and she works with religious groups of all faiths. She's the author of Bystanders, Conscience and Complicity During the Holocaust, as well as several works on churches and their role in the Holocaust. Very important to Union, she is also one of the general editors of the works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in the English translation of a Bonhoeffer series that was completed recently after years and years of painstaking work. And because of that work, she is also a teacher here at Union of Bonhoeffer. She has her PhD from George Mason University, and she too is a graduate of Union. And finally, I'm very excited to welcome Mary McRae. She is the associate professor in the Department of Applied Psychology, just down the street at NYU. The focus of Mary's work is on racial and cultural dynamics in groups and organizational life. What an amazingly huge glacier topic to take on. She is the first person of African descent to co-direct the renowned Leicester Conference at the Tavistock Institute in London. And this is the most diverse conference of its kind in the world, typically including members from over 20 different countries. She's the author of Racial Cultural Dynamics in Group and Organizational Life, Crossing Boundaries. Amongst many other publications, she's a licensed psychologist, a member of the New York affiliate of ACRIS. ACRIS, did I say that right? AK Rice. I'm sorry, I knew that, so sorry about that. And she earned her doctorate of education from Columbia University's Teachers College, just across the street. And finally, our moderator for this evening, Frances Unsell. Frances has she's an organizational consultant, psychoanalyst, and a Presbyterian minister who has spent her life partnering with organizations to address precisely these issues around leadership, working for social change for over 35 years. Her approach is one which incorporates group relations, open systems theory, and psychoanalytic thinking and practice. She's been interviewed by the New York Times and the Voice of America as an expert on thinking about how these dynamics play themselves out in the context of women's leadership and women in work. She's directed a career program at Barnard, Columbia. She's taught theory and practice at the university and at postgraduate levels. She's designed and led experimental learning programs for second career graduate students and senior religious leaders. The list of people and organizations that Frances has worked with goes on and on and on. She's a member of the International Society for Psychoanalytic Study of Organizations and the New York affiliate of A.K. Rice. And she is a graduate of Union Theological Seminary as one of those Rockefeller Fellows. And she is now founder and president of the Development Center, a not-for-profit organization that provides professional and leadership development for clients in the public and private and not-for-profit sectors. So I'm very happy to welcome Frances Unsell, who is also a personal friend, to explain this evening's program to you. Welcome, Frances.
I'm honored to be here this evening, and while I'm doing the introduction, someone's going to be handing you some cards, because at the end of the night, we're going to have a time for people from the audience to have written down questions and give them to all, and we'll go through them with the panelists, and so there'll be a real chance to have interaction. But first I want to say is how delighted I am to be here tonight, because my sense is that the time in which we are living in right now is such a volatile time and such an important time and such a difficult time for people who want to work for a better world. And oftentimes it's a confusing time that people get caught up in this whirlwind and aren't able to think. They just react. And so our panel tonight is very much going to be a chance for us to think together, actually, about what it means when we look at what's going on underneath the surface and all this turmoil we're in the midst of right now. And each one of the people in the panel have really taken up their own authority to figure out how to make a difference in this world. And also to make it when it's not always easy. Because as one of the members of the panel said to me, what I've learned through the years is that the most important work to be done is oftentimes the hardest work and is never easy. What I've learned through many, many years of working with senior leaders in organizations that work for social justice and the common good is simply, if you pay close attention to the dynamics of what's going on in society and in your organization and in other organizations, and not just what's happening on the surface and readily apparent, but what's driving it underneath. And if you take a chance to manage yourself and role, you're steady enough to do the work and withstand the waves that hit you over and over and over in the long run, and also to get a perspective of what's going on. Because it's the only analogy I can think of, and it's not a very sophisticated analogy, but if you don't have a theory and you can't think about things through theory but use your lens, working sometimes just like swatting flies in the dark, hoping you hit one. But if you work through a theory and you have some lens to work through, you've got a perspective to frame and see things in. Let me tell you a little bit about what to expect tonight. We have 3 case presenters. They're each going to present a very, very short case. And after they have finished, and I've asked them a couple of questions, Mary McRae's role is the role of a responder. And she's going to put a group relations lens on what she's heard and tease out some of the dynamics that is going on each of these. The method we're using tonight is a method that's called system psychodynamics, and it's simply the psychodynamics of social systems. It's a combination of 3 things. The first is psychoanalytic thinking, which very simply means working with what is unconscious and beneath the surface as well as on the surface. The second is group relations, which is how do groups and organizations function, both on the surface and underneath the surface. And the third is open systems theory, not family systems theory, which I know probably many of you have studied, but open systems theory, which is an organizational theory of systems, where a system breathes and is open and takes in information and ideas and money and resources from the outside and puts something out in the world that either makes a difference in the good or the bad or nothing much happens. So that's the lens we're using tonight. And then we'll have, after they have the panel and their case presentations, I'll ask them a few questions, and then we'll open it up, and I will ask some questions from the audience that are on the cards you've written out. And then at the end, if you didn't get your question answered, please feel free to stay, because the panelists will be here for individual conversation after we close. Thank you. Alex will begin. Alex McNeill, Executive Director of More Light Presbyterians.
Thank you. So More Light is a national organization that's been around for over 40 years, working within the Presbyterian Church on LGBT inclusion. And so we had some key policy goals around ordination and marriage equality, and now we've been working to leverage some of our historic advocacy work to help people of faith work in their communities for change. And when I started at More Light almost 4 years ago now, I had the opportunity to work with Francis as my coach. I'm on your list of clients and hopefully success stories. And some of the work that I got to do with Francis was really thinking about how we navigate the dynamic tension between our role, our purpose, and our group relationships. And I came to realize through that work that this is always present in nonprofit work. And it's particularly present in work within coalitions of organizations. And I believe right now that coalition work, when multiple organizations come together for a common purpose, it's vital to having the broadest and deepest impact, particularly in this political landscape when we want to address multifaceted communities working towards a common goal. So HB2 happened a year ago, the bathroom bill, among other things. And I, with More Light, I actually live in North Carolina. I'm a transgender person, so HB2 hit very close to home. And More Light was offered an opportunity, a grant funding opportunity, to work in a coalition with other organizations that were either faith-based or were North Carolina-based organizations to organize this kind of unique faith-led effort to urge the repeal of the bill, but also, importantly, to correct the assumption that a majority of people of faith supported somehow HB2. So to say, actually, our faith doesn't support this ridiculous law that would, among other things, ban people from using the bathrooms that correspond with their gender identity. So our task was to work on several coalition-led projects, as well as working within our specific faith communities. And in North Carolina, Presbyterians are abundant. So that we could ensure that there was a broad religious base of people who were represented. It wasn't just mainline Protestants. We had a group working specifically within the Black Church in North Carolina, doing really amazing organizing. And then we had a couple of state-based groups that were working to kind of get a wide-reaching range of congregations involved. So the foundation, that funded this work wasn't just interested in our individual projects. They were also interested in the success of the coalition overall. So essentially, if the coalition failed, our work failed, and we wouldn't receive any more funding, which was critical to be able to turn out people of faith in this environment. So we were, as More Light, very invested in this coalition succeeding because we saw the need for a broad religious presence in North Carolina. So we have a full-time staff member who was going to be our key representative on this coalition. And it was about 6 different organizations. And in the fall, we realized that deadlines were being missed and agendas weren't being sent out for call times, the ever-important agenda, which meant that the coalition was a little bit in chaos. We were trying to plan this really important training for 100 people of faith across North Carolina. It was scheduled for the fall, and we ended up having to delay it because the coalition wasn't working at its best, because even to the minutia of getting call time scheduled, people weren't able to come together on a regular basis. So my case study is really about my staff member coming to me in frustration and a kind of a panic that the coalition was floundering. And though we were doing some good work on our own around Presbyterian engagement, the work of the coalition in this important training wasn't happening. So through the training that I got from Francis, not to be your commercial, but kind of.
You don't have to do this. He knows it so well, you can't believe it.
So we took a step back and looked at the role of More Light in the work within the coalition. And we saw that as my staff member and myself, as native North Carolinians who were representing a national organization, that our staff member in particular could step up as a bridge person between these national and state groups that were kind of cross-talking one another, to step up to help manage the coalition's functioning, especially as the group was planning the kind of redo of this faith training. So he took up his authority and ended up having one-on-ones with every single person of the coalition to make sure that they were comfortable with him taking over this leadership. And he made his action time-bound by saying, I'm only going to do this work through the coalition leading through the end of this this training, and then we're going to do some more work to share leadership across the coalition, which was their original intention, but it kind of crumbled. And at the same time, I think this was really important because he couldn't let the coalition just absorb all of his work, that we still had to do a lot of Presbyterian-specific organizing. So he really needed to take a step up for a bit, help the coalition to thrive, and then step back a bit so that other folks within the coalition could also be in leadership roles, but making sure that this convening happened. So the training ended up happening. We had over 100 folks. It was really amazing. And I think what I've seen in so many coalition-led projects is that there's this critical moment that happens when the group can fall apart, even just from something as little as missing a couple of calls. And in seeing how our role might be able to be one to kind of step up just a little bit to make sure that the full coalition was able to meet, now it's in a healthier place, and we're able to step back and continue to do the work that we were doing, engaging Presbyterians, but also making sure the coalition as a whole continued to thrive. So that is my case study for now, and we can continue to talk.
Thank you. Amy?
In 2004, I took my first group to Bosnia to help build some houses, and we called them mission trips, which I'm sure you know is the churchy word for a volunteer, non-proselytizing work trip. That was always very important in Bosnia, that there's absolutely no proselytizing. And this summer we're taking our 6th trip and working on our 7th house. And the important thing to know is the desire to lead these trips came out of personal relationships that I have with Bosnian refugee families that were resettled in the U.S. During the 90s, during the war, at a time, if we can think back and remember when the U.S. was proud, eager, and willing to take in Muslim refugees. So it was in my home church in upstate New York that many of those folks, I think, saw it as their moral and human obligation to take folks in and help resettle them. And they became my family by grace, which is just as strong as any family by blood. So these building projects grew out of a desire, a personal desire that I had to, I don't know what you would call it, make amends or give back to a country that had given me a gift of family, and it had come out of tragedy and war there. So we wanted to do something. And it also came out of genocide, which was really nationalism clothed in religious terms during the war. And if you remember, the majority of the war crimes there were so-called Christians persecuting Muslims. So out of all of this personal story, I invited people to go to Bosnia with me, and it's always interesting and wonderful when people say yes, because I'm sure they say yes for all sorts of different reasons, and some of those come to light when we're there. People that don't know each other, people from different backgrounds, people that have different reasons for going, some people that have never been out of the state or out of the country, and then you have all these unknown group dynamics in this newly formed group, so you have this great potpourri of unconscious group dynamics. But there's something that ties us all together, and it's usually, and it's not easy for people to put it into words, but there is a group desire to be of help, to do something helpful for people that have suffered trauma, that have had difficulties, and there's also a desire to experience an adventure or another culture, and that's often in the group. And I find it important to take Americans to experience a way of being Muslim in the world. That's the Bosnian way. That was always important to me, but it grows more and more important as time goes on. And I found that the trips are eye and heart openers. There are lots of challenges that we've faced within the group dynamics. One of our primary ones is, and we talk about this before we go, we do not want to be ugly Americans, which requires self-awareness, which some of us have more of that than others. And anybody, when you get into a new situation, things look different, even within yourself. We talk a lot about flexibility before we go, and I say, I'm going to give you an abbreviation, the F word. If I may just say to you, the F word, we have to be flexible, and that's hard. It's hard for people that are naturally flexible, and when you're uncomfortable, usually it's very hot when we're there, it can be challenging. And it requires that we follow the wisdom of doing things another way. And sometimes folks judge that, well, the way we're being asked to do something is there's a more efficient way to do it, or this isn't really the way to do it. We could do it better. But we are under the direction of local workers, so we decide before we go, we're putting that aside, and we're going to be good guests where we are. And we're going to respect the way and the process that people do things differently than we do. And we come into gender issues when we're in Bosnia. Typically, women do not do construction work in Bosnia, and I think every group I've had, except for maybe one, has had more women than men in the group. So it's really exciting when we arrive and offer to help and to work, and so you have the individual reactions that people have to coming up to these gender issues, and you have the group dynamics of what happens when we encounter that too. One of my favorite stories is we were going to the work site one day, and the driver and translator said, you got to come inside with me. We were buying a pickaxe handle because we had broken the pickaxe handle. And I said, all right, but why? And he said, well, the owner wants to see you because he's never seen a woman buy a pickaxe handle before. And also I'm a Methodist pastor, so Orthodox priests, Catholic priests, Muslim imams are not women. So that's been really interesting, and usually people have been excited to meet me. They want to take my picture because I've never seen such a thing before. So lots of gender stuff that's interesting. And kind of what softens all of our challenges, and I think it goes both ways. It probably softens the challenges that we present for our host as well, is that we really focus on being good guests. And when you come in as an American, we're coming in sort of a power position that we're Americans, we have money for a project, we have the leisure to travel to do a project. So that's something we need to be very sensitive to, and trying and being open goes a long way. Drinking coffee with people, it's really important in Bosnian culture to stop and drink coffee. I was never a coffee drinker until the first time I went to Bosnia. I thought, I better learn how to do this, and we always figure out in our groups too, if not everyone drinks coffee, we have to make sure we have enough designated drinkers so that we can be polite. And it's like Turkish coffee. I mean, it's strong stuff, so it's really good. Sense of humor goes a long way. We Bosnians have a great sense of humor. It's kind of gallows humor sometimes. But we're being asked to do construction and things in ways that most of us are not used to, and we look ridiculous. So it's helpful to be able to have a sense of humor. It's a real bonding thing. And just, the ability to pitch in and work hard with unfamiliar skills, with a language barrier, those help us to be good guests. So.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm fascinated by this conversation and look forward to really engaging. I think I was invited because Francis read my book on bystanders. I wrote the book at a moment in my career where I had begun to think of this a great deal. I had written a book about the history of the church in Nazi Germany. That got me thinking about the issue of bystanders. And in the field of Holocaust studies, the understanding of bystanders is one of those aspects that has totally changed in the past 15 or 20 years. In the early years, the bystander was always portrayed and defined as a passive presence. The people who were neither perpetrators nor victims. They were silent. If you think of book titles like The World Did Nothing, this notion that there was this vast sea of humanity, not just in Nazi Germany, but internationally, that did not intervene, did not step in, allowed the genocide of the European Jews to unfold without stopping it. And so really a figure to be condemned. By the time I began to write my book, the picture was getting more complicated. And certainly when I looked at the history of the churches, it was more complicated because institutions and people that were traditionally in the early historiography portrayed as bystanders, when you look at them up close, you see how engaged they actually were, how involved they actually were. And so just in the past 10 years, there's actually an ongoing debate in the field. People don't like the word bystander anymore. They like the word onlooker or benefiter or somebody who gains materially. In other words, people take these figures on the sidelines and define them by what they do, define them by how they respond. Because what we've been discovering in the history is the extent to which people were really involved. The historian Clemens von Klemperer once described Nazi Germany as a consensual dictatorship. It's a wonderful phrase. It was a police state, it was a dictatorship, but it was a state that was in existence for 12 years. And if you are a citizen of a state for 12 years and they have certain policies in place, somehow or another you're going to be involved. You're going to be involved either through compromise, complicity, following your career, seeing things happen around you, or you may become involved by moving toward resistance, by finding ways, carving out spaces in which you can oppose this. And so these are the kinds of things that I looked at in my book. And I looked at it on three levels. On the individual level, looking at individuals in Nazi Germany and then in Nazi-occupied Europe. Looking at institutions, because social institutions, political institutions, institutions like the church carry a lot of weight in a society. They can change things. And then I looked at the international level, the international organizations and how they were reacting to what was unfolding. And just a couple of key observations that I made in my book. One was to keep in mind that human behavior exists on a continuum. In 1933, you might have sort of been a college student, a pastor, in your walk of life, things begin to happen. How do you respond to them? How do you react? Where do you get involved? Where do you step back? What do you decide not to see? What do you decide to see? These are questions that really began to play a role throughout the 1930s, and then after the war in the German occupation in occupied countries around Europe. One of the things we now know in the historiography, for example, is the extent to which ordinary people in occupied countries like Hungary, Poland, the Ukraine, actually participated in the murders of their Jewish neighbors. They weren't bystanders. Not all the killing was done in camps, not all the killing was done by German soldiers. And so you begin to look at why it is that people follow this path and actually get engaged in sort of a means of perpetrators. So the bystander figure actually exists on a continuum. They can move toward being a rescuer or resistor. They can move toward being a perpetrator, but they don't stand still. Neither do institutions. And as all this is unfolding, it's only natural that all of us, we think of ourselves as good people. We think of ourselves as people who do things for a reason. So people create moral narratives about what they're doing. They justify it. And so what you see in Nazi Germany, and this can be documented in letters and church documents, other things, are people sort of explaining why they're doing what they're doing. I didn't have a choice. I wasn't really responsible. The decision was made over here, but my job was to do this. I had to preserve my church. You begin to sort of see these kinds of alibis coming out because people have to find some way of addressing what they're doing and why they're still justified in behaving as they do. So that's also part of the bystander dynamic and what all this creates. And I think that this is the aspect that perhaps has implications for other situations, because this seems to be very much a part of human society, is that you have in Nazi Germany a normalized society that is perpetrating great evil throughout the 1930s, but in which the vast majority of Germans between 33 and 39 at least are pursuing careers, living their lives, raising their kids, engaged in their work. And there's a parallel universe in the same society of people who are being persecuted, marginalized, ostracized, targeted, arrested. And so that dynamic was one that I really tried to unpack in my book. So let me give two interesting case studies. One is an institutional one. The churches, both the Catholic and the Protestant churches, certainly had figures within both churches that emerged early as critical voices against National Socialism. They came under fire from the regime, and yet by and large the leaders of both churches essentially tried to play it safe throughout this era. Now there were lots of reasons why that was, but they wanted to preserve the church. They didn't want the state to crack down on the church. Sometimes bishops would argue that they were preserving sort of a free space that the Nazis couldn't intervene in, so they sort of portrayed this as doing something good. But what this meant over the course of the 1930s is that they became more and more embedded in a kind of society. After 1939, the war begins, the German army marches into Poland. One of the things the German army did was bring about 700,000 civilians back to the Reich as forced laborers. These were civilians, in some cases prisoners of war, Polish women and children, some of them as young as 12 or 13. The army brought them forcibly back, took them out of their communities, brought them back. Some of them worked in factories, some of them were put to work in businesses. The Catholic Church took 6,000 of them as forced laborers. The Protestant Church took 12,000. So church hospitals, institutions, monasteries, convents had forced laborers working on the grounds. The monastery where Dietrich Bonhoeffer, if people know the name Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in Ettal, in southern Bavaria, had 59 forced laborers during the time that he was there writing his ethics. 32 of them were Polish civilians, including a young couple with small children. The churches did not acknowledge this until 2000. When the historians brought the documentation and said, look at this. And at that point, both churches apologized, they paid restitution, but the length of time it took after 1945 for this to be acknowledged, I think, is revealing. So an opposite example, someone who was not a bystander. And I find that most of the people who got into rescue and resistance They didn't come from the leadership. They weren't leaders of institutions. They tended to come from the grassroots. Many of them were women, people on the margins, in a sense because I think they had a freedom that perhaps these institutional leaders didn't have. So the bravest woman I ever met in my entire life, I interviewed for my first book, which was about the confessing church. This was a woman named Helena Jacobs. She has been recognized as a righteous Gentile by Yad Vashem. During the late 1930s, she became part of a small group in Berlin that hid Jews, rescued them, gave them false papers. The group was uncovered in the early years of the war by the Gestapo. Several of members of the group were killed by the Gestapo. She ended up in a Gestapo prison until the end of the war. Her first step, 1933, she was a college student. And college students had to fill out forms under the new regime to show their racial ancestry. They had to prove that they were so-called Aryans. So you did that by going to church, you looked at the church documentation, you brought the form back, then you could be a college student. Helena Jacobs looked at that form and said, what's this? There's no such thing as an Aryan. I'm not filling this form out. And so she didn't fill out the form. She got kicked out of college. She couldn't study or get a job anywhere because for everything you did, you needed this kind of Aryan certificate. So she started working secretly for, a Jewish lawyer. Then she started working secretly as a housekeeper. Throughout the 1930s, she's kind of living on the margins, but she's finding other people who think the way she does, and she's getting involved in the resistance. The fascinating thing about Helena Jacobs was after 1945, you would think she would be celebrated as a hero in Germany. She comes out of a Gestapo prison, she's done this stuff, never made a compromise, and she can't get a job because she doesn't have a resume, she doesn't have the paperwork, and the vast majority of Germans had the degrees, the paperwork, the certificates. And so when I think about that, I think, so this is what it means not at all to be a bystander. You don't fill out the form. You don't cooperate. You find every single way. You say, this is not a system I'm going to be part of. I'm going to find a way to fight it. Now, the vast majority of us exist somewhere in between. And so the thing to think about when we think about bystanders, and this is actually one of the aspects of Holocaust history that I think resonates deeply with the visitors to the museum, resonates deeply with groups I work with, because people go through the museum and they begin to think, what would I really have done? How would I have behaved in this situation? And to think about how we are shaped in a setting, in a social setting, in a political setting, how we are shaped by those around us, and how we come to that point within ourselves where we're willing to draw a line and say, this is the line that I can't cross. I think it's an intentional process that we often don't think about. Just one closing remark. I hope I'm not going on too long. But I several years ago, as I was writing a little essay on Bonhoeffer, and I was trying to explain, Bonhoeffer is so often portrayed as sort of the good versus evil, and we tend to look at this history and we see sort of these clear lines between good and evil. And what I said in terms of his experience at the monastery, when you live in an evil system, it's like rising water. Nobody keeps their feet dry. You can't ever completely extricate yourself from what is happening around you. And so in the awareness of that, to think about what that means in one's own life and where one can begin to, take a stand, reach out, do something, I think is tremendously important. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So this is a tough act to follow. Right now, I need to make sense of all of this. So my role here is to listen to the various the three case presenters, and then to give voice to some of the thoughts and feelings that might be occurring in groups and organizations that they have talked about. And my work is really focusing on racial and cultural dynamics in groups and group and organizational life. And I look at the various levels of functioning in the group. So if you think about a group, we function as an intrapsychic. There is, what's going on in the individual. There is also the interpersonal. There is the group. There is the intergroup. and then there is the group as a whole. So I like to think about the individual and the various groups that the individual might belong to in a social, political, economic context. So we always have to think about context in terms of the group as a whole. And there are a few, thinking about the lens in which I look at stuff. So I look at boundaries between the groups and how permeable are those boundaries. Sometimes the boundaries between groups are really quite rigid, and other times they're really open and more flexible. So we always have to look at what are the boundaries that are happening, that are between the various groups. And power differences, who has power and resources and who does not. That's another important thing to consider. And then, of course, the roles of the people who represent the various groups. What are the roles that you take up? So in the work that I have done, if I'm in a group and there's a woman in charge, is gender an issue? If it's a person of color, is that an issue? If it's a person whose sexual orientation is different from the larger group, is that an issue? So these are all kinds of issues that we look at. And there is not only the social identity roles, but there's also the occupational or organizational roles, because those roles are related to the power that the individual or the groups have in the process. And then the thing that is most difficult usually to talk about is the affective patterns and the cognitive or the cognitions that's going on. And by that, what I mean is, what are the feelings, what are the hidden assumptions, the myths, the attitudes, the stereotypes that people in these various groups hold. And most of us have these assumptions and myths about people who are the other from us. And we often, we often have difficulty talking about those because, we're supposed to be in a place where we are more, socially appropriate in terms of our behaviors. But those are the kinds of things that happen very often that get us into trouble because, when we're anxious or when we're under stress or we're upset, that is the time when we're most, where we might lose it or we might say something that might be inappropriate. We might create some disconnect between the people that we're working with. So I pay a lot of attention to the kinds of feelings that people have and kinds of things that are coming up. So I just wanted to sort of preference it by that. And then I want to thank each of you for giving really very interesting cases. And I want to also note that as I read their biography, their bios, one of the things that stood out for me was the individual. So you have to think about the individual who's presenting the case, right? And here I thought, we have someone representing Presbyterian, we have someone who's representing Methodist, and then I didn't quite know how to put Vicki because, I thought, the Holocaust, so is she representing Judaism? Or what is she representing? But then I think that in a way, as a researcher and a scholar, she's not necessarily representing a group per se, but how those groups might come together, right?
But I'm Episcopalian.
Episcopalian, okay. See, that wasn't in her. Yeah. But I would like to start with Amy's story, because I thought that when I read, and we had a conversation a few days ago just to sort of introduce ourselves to each other, and when I heard what Amy had to say, I thought, here's someone who is really doing missionary work. Now, missionaries, for many of us who come from, disenfranchised groups, missionaries have a negative kind of connotation, right? So we have to think about what does it mean to be a missionary. And then working with people who are coming from a very different religion, Muslims and Christians, I thought that was interesting to consider. But what stood out for me was something that Amy said about being a good neighbor in being a good guest, being a good guest in somebody else's house, right? And I think that this is what made it really interesting to me, is that when you're working with people who are coming from a very different religious background, are you respectful of them? So I heard respect. And then I thought about the Bosnians or the Muslims that they're working with there. Tolerance was the other thing that came up, because there has to be some tolerance. So if you think about respect and tolerance in these groups, I think that that's one of the things that might be very helpful in coming together and working. And the other thing is a power difference, because in terms of the gender, you know, these Americans, I'm thinking now, like, well, what might the Bosnians be thinking? That these Americans are coming here and they are bringing women to do work that men usually do. And what does that do in terms of the differences that exist there? I think that the respect and the tolerance then helps to work across those differences. And in terms of power, the Bosnians were really in a place where they needed the assistance, they needed the help. Right? So power in organizations, or power in, especially when coalition groups come together, is something that I think is important to look at. And then a note here that I wanted to say, in terms of the, boundaries, what are the boundaries between the various gender roles? And when you come and work with someone from a different faith than your own, how do you hold on to the respect for that person's culture as well as working with your own? And I think that the history that we've seen in some places in terms of missionaries, is one that I think that Amy had to be really careful about, and other religious organizations as you're working in other countries. How careful are you with working with people from different religious groups? Especially in terms of the power with the two groups. And with Victoria, I had some difficulty because she was studying bystanders, and in some ways, as a scholar and researcher, she was taking up a similar role, because as a scholar and a researcher, you're sort of observing and looking at people, but not necessarily always intervening. So I thought that was interesting. But I saw a cartoon recently, and the cartoon had a person who was drowning in a pool. And then there was a group of people standing in front of the pool with their cell phones taking pictures, right? So I said, well, there's something about this in terms of being a bystander that in my work we would say that maybe these people are being sucked into a certain role in society. And then you need to think about, well, what role? What's the role suction here? What are they being sucked into? And I think that you can, as a bystander, or as these folk in this cartoon, that they were being sucked into a role of the individual, that they want to capture something, and maybe it might be a hit on YouTube, or the focus is much more on the individual observing and not necessarily connecting to the caring and personal thing that might be happening here. And in groups, it happens a lot with adolescents, but it also happens a lot with adults, is that when we are around other people in our group, we get pulled into a certain role. Oftentimes, before we think about it, we're acting and doing things that we might not necessarily do if we were not a part of this group. So role suction is something that I think is really important when we think about that. The other thing that is also important here is tribalism. we need to be careful of the fact that many of us now belong to tribes. And when I talk about social identities, sometimes the social identity groups become tribal groups. And when we have tribal groups, one tribe has to be superior and the other one has to be inferior. So you get into mine is better than yours. And I think that this is something that can happen in different groups, especially with the bystanders. I think that some of the examples that you gave really are indicative of the tribal way of thinking and the role suction. And I also think that in religion, because of the power of religion, we do have to be cognizant of the fact that people can get pulled into very rigid religious roles. But what I think we have here is an example of some very flexible religious roles, and I want to point that out. In Alex, you know, the whole work with coalitions, when you work with a number of different coalition groups, I think that the struggle is how do you hold on to your group that you're representing and at the same time take on another role? Because, you know, if you're representing a group, you're expected to voice what their values and whatever their mission is. Well, when you form a coalition, if you're working with different groups, the thing is, we call it containment. How do you contain all of those coalitions together while at the same time holding on to your own individual group that you're representing? It's not always an easy thing to do. If you think about ever having represented a group and then you come together with the different coalitions, how do you hold it together? And what I thought was particularly interesting to me is that, you know, as a transgender person, what might that mean? Because in our society today, transgender is not a role that has been high up in the society. It's been a role that's been denigrated very often. So when you are in a role in an organization, how is that organization authorizing you to take up that role? So this can be true for a transgender person, this can be true for a woman, this can be true for a person of color. You take up the role, but how are you authorized by that organization to take up your role? Now, I think what's interesting is that Alex has a position of power in that organization, so that when he talked about coalition building, he could actually have one of his staff members to take up the leadership because the leadership wasn't being provided in a way that I thought that you thought that would have worked better. But if he had not had that power role, then what might that have been like? So my thinking here was about when you take up a role, how do you get authorized by the organization to take that role up? And as an individual, how are you personally authorizing yourself to take up the role? All right, so I think that the two things are really quite important. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Well, now, Frances and I both do group relations work, so I'm asking her to add in if there's something that I've left out in some of these cases. You might want to add something.
One thing before I move into asking three questions, I was thinking about, I always look at, when I go into a group, I spend a lot of time looking at boundaries, like you mentioned, but I also chase the anxiety and I chase the power. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for where there's anxiety in the institution or organization or dynamics, and where's the power. Mm-hmm. Those are just two things I chase, and I mean chase. I have questions now for each of the three presenters that are the case presenters, and we'll answer those for a few minutes and then move on to some more questions. Alex has done what I consider some very important work and some very original work on a theology of abundance. And my question to him is, what is that theology? number one? And number two, how does that theology influence the way you work for legislative change?
Okay. So when we were looking at achieving the two policy goals that we really set out to achieve, one of the things that I looked at was thinking about, in this next era, what is the vision that's going to propel us forward for the next 40 years of our work? And having visited a lot of welcoming churches in my time as executive director, I kept hearing stories about how the church evolved in their welcome. And the story would always go in a version of, first we welcomed gay people, and then lesbians, and then we learned about bisexual people. And then someone would actually say to me a lot, and now transgender people? What's next? Which, chasing the anxiety, is, what don't we know? Who don't we know about? And I started to see this idea around the way welcome had been conceptualized is one identity in at a time. In the first part of this movement, we were first starting to say these words out loud to name our identities. But an identity-based vision had run its course. So in terms of thinking about a theology of abundance, I started to reflect on the idea that God, what if we thought about who God is as a way to understand who we are? And it hit me one day that God is so much bigger than we can ever describe, that we've tried in this project of religion to name who God is for 5,000 years or more, and there's no one name that is essential to who God is, except for God itself. And so if we believe that our God is abundant, is of limitless possibilities and expansion, what would it mean if we as God's creations were also abundant, that no one name was enough to describe who we are? To think about this idea of welcome not as a series of ors, but as the fullness of and. So what if we're gay and black and Southern? What would that look like in our work? And so that I started to think about, what if our vision is that we seek to follow a God of abundance with awe and wonder? That we instead of, when you see abundance kind of zipping up your tent and being afraid of this vast sky, what if you see this huge image of God and instead embrace that with awe? What would that look like if I in turn embraced your abundance in the same way? And that's really been influential in how we started to think about our work. And in terms of legislative work, which often is not in a culture of abundance, very scarcity thinking. You know, HB 2, as an example, was not just a bathroom bill. It also sought to limit the ability for a living wage, towns to establish their own living wage, or non-discrimination ordinances, also to bring discrimination claims. If we're working under this idea of abundance, I think often it's not just about zeroing in on the one piece of our identity that's under threat, being transgender in the bathrooms, but to actually build a broad coalition of people whose identities are being impacted in multiple ways, especially transgender people of color who, for example, can't get a job, can't be paid a living wage, can't file a discrimination claim. If we start there with that fullness of and we approach our legislator to say, here's how this is impacting not just this one small power, white folks within the community, but to actually look at how it impacts a lot of different facets of our identities. To me, that is how abundance really impacts the ways that we even approach the problem. And even in coalition work, my staff member and I often say we believe in abundance, because coalitions get so into scarcity that there's not enough time, there's not enough to go around. And when our staff person stepped up, it was from a place of abundance, that we were willing to share leadership. And when it was time to take up a particular role, to be more in a leadership position, that was only for a specific time, and then we wanted to share it again because we believed in this idea that we live in an abundant world.
Alex, thank you so much. As you all heard earlier, Amy, besides all the other things she does in Bosnia and pastors a church, she's also a student at the Jung Institute in Zurich, which is one of those 10-year programs of learning. Serious work. And so I'm going to ask her, in regard to her work in Bosnia, Amy, what archetypes are floating around in your work, and how do you work with those and use those?
Now, when Francis came up with this question for me, I thought, really? You're going to ask me about archetypes at Union? Because archetypes are not socially appropriate. So, but they're important, so I'm going to answer the question. Because archetypes have power individually and culturally, and they're more powerful than just transference. So, and there's a great temptation, I think, to identify with the archetypes, so that's something that we have to work through when we're in Bosnia with the groups. We need to have awareness of what's going on so we can ground it so people don't identify. Because probably the biggest archetype that we encounter is the American archetype. And I already talked about we don't want to be ugly Americans. That is not, though, the archetype that Bosnians tend to think of Americans. Most Bosnians have family now that lives in the U.S. or knows an American, or they've seen a lot of TV and movies, so that's more of what folks are thinking of. But also Americans as saviors, because Bill Clinton is credited in Bosnia for stopping the war. And the Dayton Accords, which cemented the end of the war, happened in Dayton, Ohio. The first time I heard this, I thought that, Americans and Bill Clinton have all this glitz and glamour. I thought, wow, I thought of us as bystanders. I remember sitting in the living room with my Bosnian friends when Srebrenica happened. And I remember they were looking for people they knew. I didn't know anyone, but I sat there with them because I love them, looking for faces that I knew. So this was a real disconnect for me, that Americans, are saviors, but that is one of the archetypes that's definitely going on there. And I know what I look like. There's also sort of a fairy godmother archetype that goes on, because we go to work with people that have no hope that their life is going to change. There's a really high unemployment rate. There's trauma everywhere. The government is corrupt. They can't get their act together. People want to work. They want a better life, and there is no tangible hope of that happening, to have the money to rebuild their house, to have a safe... We've helped folks that are living in shacks and are sick from living, and then we come in, poof, you have a house at some point. And we usually take a group picture with everybody, with the team and the local workers. And one of the people that we helped years ago said, "I'm so glad you did that, because I tell people what happened and nobody believes it. They say, really? A bunch of Americans came in and fixed your house? Why would anybody do that?" So there's this magical element to that happening, and that is also a dangerous thing. When you're on the other end of that, you can't believe it. And it's helpful because a lot of the folks that go on these teams are middle class, working class. We've made money from bake sales and car washes, and it's hard work to make enough money for building supplies. So people that are going, the Americans are thinking, this isn't, we're not this. So it's a growth experience for people to see this archetype coming at them and realize, no, we are rich. Look at what we have. And to kind of take stock and not only realize that in their own life, but it opens up a door to see, where are we failing in our country? Who is hoping for magic, in their life, that they don't have the opportunities that we do. You do this, and things are going to get better. So that has been, I've seen that transformation happen with people, and that's really important. That changes lives. It changes the direction of lives, or it can. And again, it's the being of guest that I think opens you up to not buying into this, because somebody wise once said to me, in every group there is somebody, and you don't want to be that somebody. So that's, we talk about that before we go. We don't, and when you're there, you don't want to be a jerk, because of this amazing hospitality that we receive. And that's another one of the archetypes. There's this mother nurturing archetype that is quite amazing. The women in Bosnia are tremendous cooks, and they prepare these amazing meals. They have these beautiful gardens. People that are very poor have flowers that they've planted in their houses. They have an herbal remedy for everything, and will take you out to the field to find what it is. These amazing dinners. Family and children are very, very important. I know that from our friends that came as refugees, that we've gone back to Bosnia, and I say how much I love their country where they came from, and they said, we did it. We left for the children. So we want them to have a life, because they all would still be there if it weren't, for that. And the other thing about the archetypes is the temptation is to idealize the experience that you've had too, because it is this amazing snippet of time. It's that way for the families, it's that way for the folks on the team, but you cannot buy into that's what it's like there, because it's not. We're there in the summer, folks are returning to visit family, and then life is very hard. Most young people would leave if they could. Their government is completely corrupt. The path to the EU is a mess. There's lots of there's trauma, everywhere in different stages of being dealt with and not. So it's important to be aware of these archetypes that are coming at us, so you can't believe them, or you've got trouble.
Could I just add that I think that these are internalized messages. When people encounter one another, we see something and we make certain assumptions about who that person is. So we internalize certain messages that then get carried on. So I think that might be something to consider.
Vicki, in your book, you wrote, I have a sentence I pulled out when I was reading it, even before I knew you were coming. It is activism, the fight against indifference, the rebellion against silence that demands a monumental and courageous effort. What is moral courage?
It's a good thing she told me this ahead of time. So I've been thinking, and I still don't have a simple answer. As I thought about it, I think it's like everything else, kind of a process. Courage that one word may not be able to contain everything that's in it, but I think it has something to do with the capacity to step outside our own bubble, our own sphere of normality, and take a risk when we see something wrong. And as well as the awareness, this is not just empathy, but the awareness of what it must mean to be vulnerable. And that's something, if you're in a position of privilege, you don't have. I mean, and even if you think, even if you sort of see someone, you say, you understand their situation is vulnerable. That's not the same thing as feeling it in your marrow. I mean, knowing what that means to be in a situation in a society where you will be a target, or when people see you, they think certain things. And the capacity for someone to move to that place and actually really stand with the victims and take their fight as their own, I think we don't see very often, but I would say that's what courage is.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to ask the whole panel one question, but as they're answering, someone will come around and take your questions. pick up your pieces of paper, and after that, we'll have a few questions that you've asked. The final question for all of you is, this is just a question, and this is a quote from Bonhoeffer's The Ethics, that if I'm right, it was finished and published after he died. And it is simply, has the church merely to gather up those whom the will has crushed, or has she to prevent the will from crushing them? Again, has the church merely to gather up those whom the will has crushed, or prevent the will from crushing them? And I want to ask each one of you how your work prevents the will from crushing people. Any, all, or none may answer.
Well, working within a denomination around LGBT issues with LGBT folks who, in some sense, have been crushed by the wheel, I think, but want to prevent the wheel from crushing others. I think the way that we prevent that from happening is by sharing a different vision of what's possible when a group of people come together to work for the betterment of the world through their understanding of God. And so one of the ways that we try to do that is show what worship can look like when we empower different voices, to show what liturgy can be when we take the experiences of people of color who are queer at the heart. And I've seen the ways in which that vision has helped tell a new story for what the church can be and breathe life into an institution that sometimes tells itself the story that it's dying. To see people for whom they haven't given up hope on the church, who may have been crushed by an institution for decades, but then to say, actually, I think there's a new way forward, I believe is a way to kind of remake and remodel what's possible when we talk about the church itself.
I can respond to the question, but more as a psychologist, because I really do believe that when people are able to truly express authentically what they're feeling and thinking, and to share those thoughts and feelings as opposed to holding them in, and we tend to hold stuff in and act it out so it comes out in different ways. But I have found that when people can actually have the space and time to actually talk about what they're thinking and feeling, that it does really make a difference. And so, I mean, my work really involves opening up a space for people to say things that they might not say, to speak the unspeakable, and it frees them up. And I think that that's important.
And I think the last two of you are going to be caught. Think about the will. What is the will in our society? What is the will in our world? What are the many wills? What can you do to prevent that will from getting to people, from crushing them?
I'd love it if the church would stop being the wheel, but I think we all feel that way. There are lots of ways that the church does that, but I think the church being a safe place for people to talk and to open up is a first step, but it's not easy. And there are a lot of dynamics in churches, many that have been going on for decades, in individual places that make that difficult. But I think folks can have moral courage and talk.
I'm going to sort of answer this. I hope I'll answer it. Picking up on what you just said, I think for me, at least at the museum, there's a methodology, but there's a reason why I do that methodology. I work with an incredibly diverse number of groups. I mean, just as an example, last week we had several Muslim leaders from Kurdistan who are very engaged in trying to build interfaith networks in that situation. And to go through a history museum with a group from another, from a completely different perspective to mine, they see things I don't see, they have insights I don't have, and they can shed a light on the history that opens up new questions. And that's what is most exciting for me in my work, is to work with people and go through this history with them. I can tell them what the history is, but they bring their own experience, their own questions, and that gets a different kind of conversation. And increasingly, I think those conversations are really important in our world today.
Now it's time for questions that have been written by the audience. Thank you. Now this one I might need help with. So whoever it is, pitch in. If I'm following, how can we handle is it the Jews that have been, no, how can we handle the what? Whose was this? I can't read the writing. Okay, I'll go to the next one. This is for Alex and Amy. What about conflict? And how did you address it?
Oh, let me think. When I take a team, we get together usually in the evening and share what people have experienced during the day to find out where people are, if there are questions, if there are things building. So that's primarily how we've handled conflict. I also tell people when we go, we'll try to decide things as a group, if possible. Sometimes that isn't the expedient way to do it, and sometimes I'll have to make decisions for the group that we might not like or agree with, but that's how we're going to do it. So sometimes we have to talk through things that people might not have wanted to do a different way or didn't understand or didn't like. So primarily we handle the conflict through trying to talk it out as much as we're able to.
I think that's similar for us too, that we've tried to mitigate conflict by having individual conversations with folks who might feel frustrated within a coalition, but really seeing that the relationships that we have with each other are more critical, and so if someone's feeling anger about a decision or frustration, that they feel comfortable and safe to come to one of us to talk about it. Because again, I think having a role of saying openly, like, we want to talk about conflict as it happens rather than letting it fester has been really helpful, particularly within this coalition that had a little bit of a rocky start and needed to have some very intentional conversations around how we share our role in the work.
This was for Vicki. From your perspective, they're asking you to draw some parallels between Germany in the 30s and the U.S. today.
That's not the question. The question is it useful or appropriate to make those parallels?
Right, okay.
Is it useful or appropriate to make parallels between Germany in the 30s and the U.S. today?
There are built-in risks. Historians of the Holocaust don't like people to say he's just like Hitler, these are just like the Nazis. The danger being that there really are distinctions, and my observation is that it's easy to end up fighting the wrong fight if you think your enemy is just like the Nazis. But I think that the analogies, one of the analogies that I think is useful to think about is this issue of bystanders. How do human beings behave when they see people being targeted, being persecuted, being treated as the other? I think those dynamics are similar today. I think they were similar in our own history of this country with regard to a number of groups. and similar in other situations around the world. So there's certain ways in which people behave, and in Nazi Germany we see one horrendous case study of where this can lead. But I think that's a more useful avenue to take.
And this is the last question of the evening, and it's for all the panelists. I figured out what it said. How can we handle the fear that has been stimulated in us, that is being used to undermine our better selves? How do we handle the fear?
That's a great question. It's funny because I was telling somebody recently that I feel that no one anymore is speaking to our better selves. That there's a way of calling, trying to appeal to the best side of people, and you don't hear that very often these days. So the flip side of that, how do we handle that fear? My gut instinct would be to say proactively to push back and push that back to trying to turn it to a discussion about what we want to be. I mean, I love your theology of abundance, a vision of what we could be, and all the things we've achieved, and the wonderful people in this society from all different groups who, have really, this is in so many ways a remarkable country and a remarkable moment that I feel like I try to look at those sort of light, bright spots as opposed to the darker spots. So.
See, I think fear is something that most of us don't want to acknowledge that we have it. So it's important to first acknowledge that fear exists. Because if you can't acknowledge it, then it's hard to deal with it. And I also think that fear can be used as a defense not to take action. So if you are afraid of something, it can sort of shut you down and you really don't have to think about doing something. And one of the things that I think that faith, and the title of this talk, Faith in America, is really quite helpful, is that I think that churches and religion and spirituality can really help people to be in touch with fear and to help them to have some type of hope and faith that they can overcome or deal with that fear. Because when fear just sits, it can create other kinds of problems. So if we can acknowledge it and begin to work on ways in which we might deal with fear, I think it can be quite freeing.
I think we can look at the good, and that's, I think, part of the fears. We're afraid the good is going away, or somebody else has it, we don't have it anymore. But I think of it as Jesus' metaphor of the kingdom. It's coming, but it's also within us and among us. So all of this good it's already here. So this fear kind of convinces us not to see it anymore. I mean, this is, a wonderful country and wonderful people and people doing good and moving forward, and fear can make us not see that at all.
I agree with you that I believe fear comes from this place of scarcity, that potentially if you take a risk, if you're vulnerable, that vulnerability won't be met with love, because maybe there's not enough to go around. And so I think fear can be helpful in showing us the thing that we want the most, that we wish for the most. I'm afraid of not having community when the thing we want the most is good community. And so for me, the way that I work through fear is to see what it's showing me, and then try to get below that to this place of abundance, that if I take this risk, if I do something that I'm afraid to do, that potentially the universe is waiting with something good on the other side.
I'm going to break out a role, and I had some thoughts on this question too. One is, it says, how do we deal with this fear? I think one is a kind of sureness that some people have, that they're going to be able to take a risk and get hit and get knocked down and get up again. It's a kind of sense of both the ability to do with efficacy and both the ability of, I can take it. I had one client say to me, I realized after works and works and works, and this was leadership work and not even psychoanalysis, but it was like a tsunami coming at me, and I got knocked down and I'd get up again. It would come back again, I'd get knocked down and I'd get up again. And I learned I had the strength to do it and keep being effective. That was one thought. And the other thought on this is in many ways I connect anxiety and fear often is linked. You know, because the real simple definition of anxiety is fear of the future. And fear is often used as something more specific. I'm scared of, or this. But I also think it grows out of a basic kind of anxiety and fear of the future. And I link those two. We have ended this evening, and I want to thank the four panelists for what they've done for us, and turn it back over to President Jones.
So just to remind people that we have Lema Bowie coming up next, and after that on April 20, I don't have my notes with me. Bring them up. Yes, on April 5th, Lema Bowie will be the speaker for Faith in America, and on April 20th, William Barber will be here. And Francis, do you want to tell us about tomorrow?
Tomorrow's Pamela, and I'll tell you about the end of the month.
All right. Yeah.
This is Psychology Week at Union, which is really great. Tomorrow night, we're having our annual Psychology and Religion sponsored event, which is a screening of the documentary Newtown about the school shootings in Newtown, Connecticut, and how the community was able to work through the grief and the horror, and at least in many instances to become resilient in the aftermath, but also how many of the members of the community turned their grief and their trauma into activism for gun control legislation. And so we're going to have a screening of the film. It will be, for the first time, shown on PBS next month, so this is a great opportunity to have a preview in the theater space of our chapel. And then we'll have a brief panel following that with Lisa Cataldo, who is one of our Union PhD alumni in Psych and Religion, Matthew Krebin, who is the senior pastor of the Newtown UCC, who was one of the first responders, and Nick Stewart, who's the executive producer from Odyssey. So please come back tomorrow night. It's free. You've got to register, so we just have a sense of how many people are going to come, but you can come for free. So you're welcome to come back tomorrow night upstairs in the chapel. Thank you.
So two more announcements. We're quickly approaching the deadline for our Millennial Leaders Project, which happens in July for millennial leaders who come together to network. And then if you're very interested in what we talked about tonight, on April 28th, we'll be having a full day. It's a Saturday. It's a Friday, excuse me. We'll be having a deeper dive in a full day workshop at Union. And you can go to our website to find out about this workshop and register for it. So again, thank you all for coming this evening, and our speakers are still here, and let the conversation continue. Thank you.
I have to go, but you may want to come visit us. I know some people. Great. What you think? Yeah. I know. Great. Oh, I see.